The Emperor's New Suit by Hans Christian Andersen. Read for LibriVox.org by Ernst Patinama. Many, many years ago lived an emperor who thought so much of new clothes that he spent all his money in order to obtain them. His only ambition was to be always well dressed. He did not care for his soldiers, and the theatre did not amuse him. The only thing, in fact, he thought anything of was to drive out and show a new suit of clothes. He had a coat for every hour of the day, and, as one would say of a king, he is in his cabinet, so one could say of him, the emperor is in his dressing room. The great city where he resided was very gay. Every day many strangers from all parts of the globe arrived. One day 2 swindlers came to the city. They made people believe that they were weavers and declared they could manufacture the finest cloth to be imagined. Their colors and patterns, they said, were not only exceptionally beautiful, but the clothes made of their material possessed the wonderful quality of being invisible to any man who was unfit for his office or unpardonably stupid. "That must be wonderful cloth," thought the emperor. "If I were to be dressed in a suit made of this cloth, I should be able to find out which men in my empire were unfit for their places, and I could distinguish the clever from the stupid. I must have this cloth woven for me without delay." And he gave a large sum of money to the swindlers in advance, that they should set to work without any loss of time. They set up 2 looms and pretended to be very hard at work, but they did nothing whatever on the looms. They asked for the finest silk and the most precious gold cloth. All they got they did away with, and worked at the empty looms till late at night. "I should very much like to know how they are getting on with the cloth," thought the emperor. But he felt rather uneasy when he remembered that he who was not fit for his office could not see it. Personally, he was of opinion that he had nothing to fear, yet he thought it advisable to send somebody else first to see how matters stood. Everybody in the town knew what a remarkable quality the stuff possessed, and all were anxious to see how bad or stupid the neighbors were. "I shall send my honest old minister to the weavers," thought the emperor. "He can judge best how the stuff looks, for he is intelligent, and nobody understands his office better than he." The good old minister went into the room where the swindlers sat before the empty looms. "Heaven preserve us," he thought, and opened his eyes wide. "I cannot see anything at all." But he did not say so. Both swindlers requested him to come near, and asked him if he did not admire the exquisite pattern and the beautiful colors, pointing to the empty looms. The poor old minister tried his very best, but he could see nothing, for there was nothing to be seen. "Oh dear," he thought, "can I be so stupid? I should never have thought so, and nobody must know it. Is it possible that I am not fit for my office? No, no, I cannot say that I was unable to see the cloth." "Now, have you got nothing to say?" said one of the swindlers, while he pretended to be busily waving. "Oh, it is very pretty, exceedingly beautiful," replied the old minister, looking through his glasses. "What a beautiful pattern! What brilliant colors! I shall tell the emperor that I like the cloth very much." "We are pleased to hear that," said the 2 weavers, and described to him the colors and explained a curious pattern. The old minister listened attentively, that he might relate to the emperor what they said. And so he did. Now the swindlers asked for more money, silk and gold cloth, which they required for weaving. They kept everything for themselves, and not a thread came near the loom, but they continued, as hitherto, to work at the empty looms. Soon afterwards the emperor sent another honest courtier to the weavers, to see how they were getting on, and if the cloth was nearly finished. Like the old minister, he looked and looked, but could see nothing, as there was nothing to be seen. "Is it not a beautiful piece of cloth?" asked the two swindlers, showing and explaining the magnificent pattern, which, however, did not exist. "I am not stupid," said the man. "It is therefore my good appointment for which I am not fit. It is very strange, but I must not let anyone know it." And he praised the cloth, which he did not see, and expressed his joy at the beautiful colors and the fine pattern. "It is very excellent," he said to the emperor. Everybody in the whole town talked about the precious cloth. At last the emperor wished to see it himself while it was still on the loom. With a number of courtiers, including the two who had already been there, he went to the two clever swindlers, who now worked as hard as they could, but without using any thread. "Is it not magnificent?" said the two old statesmen who had been there before. "Your Majesty must admire the colors and the pattern." And then they pointed to the empty looms, for they imagined the others could see the cloth. "What is this?" thought the emperor. "I do not see anything at all. That is terrible. Am I stupid? Am I unfit to be emperor? That would indeed be the most dreadful thing that could happen to me." "Really," he said, turning to the weavers, "your cloth has our most gracious approval." And nodding contentedly, he looked at the empty loom, for he did not like to say that he saw nothing. All his attendants, who were with him, looked and looked, and although they could not see anything more than the others, they said, like the emperor, "It is very beautiful," and all advised him to wear the new magnificent clothes at the great procession which was soon to take place. "It is magnificent, beautiful, excellent," one heard them say. Everybody seemed to be delighted, and the emperor appointed the two swindlers imperial court weavers. The whole night, previous to the day on which the procession was to take place, the swindlers pretended to work, and burned more than 16 candles. People should see that they were busy to finish the emperor's new suit. They pretended to take the cloth from the loom, and walked about in the air with big scissors, and sewed with needles without thread, and said at last, "The emperor's new suit is ready now." The emperor and all his barons then came to the hall. The swindlers held their arms up as if they held something in their hands, and said, "These are the trousers, this is the coat, and here is the cloak," and so on. They are all as light as a cobweb, and one must feel as if one had nothing at all upon the body. But that is just the beauty of them. "Indeed," said all the courtiers, but they could not see anything, for there was nothing to be seen. "Does it please your Majesty now to graciously undress," said the swindlers, "that we may assist your Majesty in putting on the new suit before the large looking-glass?" The emperor undressed, and the swindlers pretended to put a new suit upon him, one piece after another, and the emperor looked at himself in the glass from every side. "How well they look, how well they fit," said all. "What a beautiful pattern, what fine colors! That is a magnificent suit of clothes." The master of the ceremonies announced that the bearers of the canopy, which was to be carried in the procession, were ready. "I am ready," said the emperor. "Does not my suit fit me marvelously?" Then he turned once more to the looking-glass, that people should think he admired his garments. The chamberlains, who were to carry the train, stretched their hands to the ground as if they lifted up a train, and pretended to hold something in their hands. They did not like people to know that they could not see anything. The emperor marched in the procession under the beautiful canopy, and all who saw him in the street and out of the windows exclaimed, "Indeed, the emperor's new suit is incomparable! What a long train he has! How well it fits him!" Nobody wished to let others know he saw nothing, for then he would have been unfit for his office, or too stupid. Never emperor's clothes were more admired.
"But he has nothing on at all,"
said a little child at last. "Good heavens, listen to the voice of an innocent child," said the father, and one whispered to the other what the child had said. "But he has nothing on at all," cried at last the whole people. That made a deep impression upon the emperor, for it seemed to him that they were right. But he thought to himself, "Now I must bear up to the end." And the chamberlains walked with still greater dignity, as if they carried the train which did not exist. End of The Emperor's New Suit. This recording is in the public domain.
The Red Shoes by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alex Eading. The Red Shoes by Hans Christian Andersen. There once was a little girl who was very pretty and delicate, but in summer she was forced to run about with bare feet. She was so poor, and in winter wore very large wooden shoes, which made her little insteps quite red, and that looked so dangerous. In the middle of the village lived old Dame Shoemaker. She sat and sewed together as well as she could a little pair of shoes out of old red strips of cloth. They were very clumsy, but it was a kind thought. They were meant for the little girl. The little girl was called Karen. On the very day her mother was buried, Karen received the red shoes and wore them for the first time. They were certainly not intended for mourning, but she had no others, and with stockingless feet she followed the poor straw coffin in them. Suddenly a large old carriage drove up, and a large old lady sat in it. She looked at the little girl, felt compassion for her, and then said to the clergyman, "Here, give me the little girl. I will adopt her." And Karen believed all this happened on account of the red shoes. But the old lady thought they were horrible, and they were burnt. But Karen herself was cleanly and nicely dressed. She must learn to read and sew, and people said she was a nice little thing. But the looking-glass said, "Thou art more than nice. Thou art beautiful." Now the queen once traveled through the land, and she had her little daughter with her. And this little daughter was a princess, and people streamed to the castle, and Karen was there also. And the little princess stood in her fine white dress in a window, and let herself be stared at. She had neither a train nor a golden crown, but splendid red morocco shoes. They were certainly far handsomer than those Dame Shoemaker had made for little Karen. Nothing in the world can be compared with red shoes. Now Karen was old enough to be confirmed. She had new clothes, and was to have new shoes also. The rich shoemaker in the city took the measure of her little foot. This took place at his house, in his room, where stood large glass cases filled with elegant shoes and brilliant boots. All this looked charming, but the old lady could not see well, and so had no pleasure in them. In the midst of the shoes stood a pair of red ones, just like those the princess had worn. How beautiful they were! The shoemaker said also they had been made for the child of a count, but had not fitted. "That must be patent leather," said the old lady. "They shine so." "Yes, they shine," said Karen, "and they fitted and were bought," but the old lady knew nothing about their being red. Else she would never have allowed Karen to have gone in red shoes to be confirmed. Yet such was the case. Everybody looked at her feet, and when she stepped through the chancel door on the church pavement, it seemed to her as if the old figures on the tombs, those portraits of old preachers and preachers' wives with their stiff ruffs and long black dresses, fixed their eyes on her red shoes. And she thought only of them as the clergyman laid his hand upon her head and spoke of the holy baptism, of the covenant with God, and how she should now be a matured Christian. And the organ pealed so solemnly, the sweet children's voices sang, and the old music directors sang, but Karen only thought of her red shoes. In the afternoon, the old lady heard from everyone that the shoes had been red, and she said that it was very wrong of Karen, that it was not at all becoming, and that in the future Karen should only go in black shoes to church, even when she should be older. The next Sunday there was a sacrament, and Karen looked at the black shoes, looked at the red ones, looked at them again, and put on the red shoes. The sun shone gloriously. Karen and the old lady walked along the path through the corn. It was rather dusty there. At the church door stood an old soldier with a crutch, and with a wonderfully long beard, which was more red than white. And he bowed to the ground and asked the old lady whether he might dust her shoes. And Karen stretched out her little foot. "See what beautiful dancing shoes," said the soldier. "Sit firm when you dance." And he put his hand out towards the soles. And the old lady gave the old soldier alms and went into the church with Karen. And all the people in the church looked at Karen's red shoes and all the pictures, and as Karen knelt before the altar and raised the cup to her lips, she only thought of the red shoes, and they seemed to swim in it. And she forgot to sing her psalm, and she forgot to pray, "Our Father in heaven." Now, all the people went out of the church, and the old lady got into her carriage. Karen raised her foot to get in after her, when the old soldier said, "Look what beautiful dancing shoes!" And Karen could not help dancing a step or two. And when she began, her feet continued to dance. It was just as though the shoes had power over them. She danced round the church corner. She could not leave off. The coachman was obliged to run after her and catch hold of her. And he lifted her in the carriage, but her feet continued to dance, so that she trod on the old lady dreadfully. At length she took the shoes off, and then her legs had peace. The shoes were placed in the closet at home, but Karen could not avoid looking at them. Now the old lady was sick, and it was said that she could not recover. She must be nursed and waited upon, and there was no one whose duty it was so much as Karen's. But there was a great ball in the city to which Karen was invited. She looked at the old lady, who could not recover. She looked at the red shoes, and she thought there could be no sin in it. She put on the red shoes. She might do that also, she thought, but then she went to the ball and began to dance. When she wanted to dance to the right, the shoes would dance to the left, and when she wanted to dance up the room, the shoes danced back again, down the steps, into the street, and out of the city gate. She danced and was forced to dance straight out into the gloomy wood. Then it was suddenly light up among the trees, and she fancied it must be the moon, for there was a face, but it was the old soldier with the red beard. He sat there, nodded his head, and said, "Look what beautiful dancing shoes." Then she was terrified and wanted to fling off the red shoes, but they clung fast, and she pulled down her stockings, but the shoes seemed to have grown to her feet, and she danced and must dance over the fields and meadows, in rain and sunshine, by night and day, but at night it was the most fearful. She danced over the churchyard, but the dead did not dance. They had something better to do than dance. She wished to seat herself on a poor man's grave, where the bitter tansy grew, but for her there was neither peace nor rest, and when she danced towards the open church door, she saw an angel standing there. He wore long, white garments. He had wings which reached from his shoulders to the earth. His countenance was severe and grave, and in his hand he held a sword, broad and glittering. "Dance shalt thou," said he, "dance in thy red shoes till thou art pale and cold, till thy skin shrivels up, and thou art a skeleton. Dance shalt thou from door to door, and where proud, vain children dwell, thou shalt knock, that they may hear thee and tremble. Dance shalt thou." "Mercy!" cried Karen, but she did not hear the angel's reply, for the shoes carried her through the gate, into the fields, across roads and bridges, and she must keep ever dancing. One morning she danced past a door which she well knew. Within sounded a psalm. A coffin decked with flowers was borne forth. Then she knew that the old lady was dead, and felt that she was abandoned by all and condemned by the angel of God. She danced and was forced to dance through the gloomy night. The shoes carried her over stack and stone. She was torn till she bled. She danced over the heath till she came to a little house. Here, she knew, dwelt the executioner. And she tapped with her fingers at the window and said, "Come out, come out! I cannot come in, for I am forced to dance." And the executioner said, "Thou dost not know who I am, I fancy. I strike bad people's heads off, and I hear that my axe rings." "Don't strike my head off," said Karen. "Then I can't repent of my sins, but strike off my feet in the red shoes." And then she confessed her entire sin, and the executioner struck off her feet with the red shoes, but the shoes danced away with the little feet across the field into the deep wood. And he carved out little wooden feet for her, and crutches, taught her the psalm criminals always sing, and she kissed the hand which had wielded the axe, and went over the heath. "Now I have suffered enough for the red shoes," said she. "Now I will go into the church, that people may see me." And she hastened towards the church door. But when she was near it, the red shoes danced before her, and she was terrified, and turned round. The whole week she was unhappy, and wept many bitter tears. But when Sunday returned, she said, "Well, now I have suffered and struggled enough. I really believe I am as good as many a one who sits in the church and holds her head so high." And away she went boldly. But she had not got farther than the churchyard gate before she saw the red shoes dancing before her, and she was frightened and turned back and repented of her sin from her heart. And she went to the parsonage and begged that they would take her into service. She would be very industrious, she said, and would do everything she could. She did not care about the wages, only she wished to have a home and be with good people. And the clergyman's wife was sorry for her and took her into service. And she was industrious and thoughtful. She sat still and listened when the clergyman read the Bible in the evenings. All the children thought a great deal of her, but when they spoke of dress and grandeur and beauty, she shook her head. The following Sunday, when the family was going to church, they asked her whether she would not go with them. But she glanced sorrowfully, with tears in her eyes, at her crutches. The family went to hear the word of God, but she went alone into her little chamber. There was only room for a bed and chair to stand in it, and here she sat down with her prayer book. And while she read with a pious mind, the wind bore the strains of the organ towards her, and she raised her tearful countenance and said, "O God, help me." And the sun shone so clearly, and straight before her stood the angel of God in white garments, the same she had seen the night at church at the door. But he no longer carried the sharp sword, but in its stead of splendid green spray full of roses, and he touched the ceiling with the spray, and the ceiling rose so high, and where he had touched it, there gleamed a golden star. And he touched the walls, and they widened out, and she saw the organ which was playing. She saw the old pictures of the preachers and the preachers' wives. The congregation sat in cushioned seats, and sang out of their prayer books. For the church itself had come to the poor girl in her narrow chamber, or else she had come into the church. She sat in a pew with the clergyman's family, and when they had ended the psalm and looked up, they nodded and said, "It is right that thou art come." "It was through mercy," she said, and the organ pealed, and the children's voices in the choir sounded so sweet and soft. The clear sunshine streamed so warmly through the window in the pew where Karen sat. Her heart was so full of sunshine, peace, and joy that it broke. Her soul flew on the sunshine to God, and there no one asked after the red shoes. End of The Red Shoes by Hans Christian Andersen. Recording by Alex Eating.
Two Maidens by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Miriam Esther Goldman. Two Maidens by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H.P. Paul. Have you ever seen a maiden? I mean what our pavers call a maiden, a thing with which they ram down the paving stones in the roads. A maiden of this kind is made altogether of wood, broad below, and girt round with iron rings. At the top she is narrow, and has a stick passed across through her waist, and this stick forms the arms of the maiden. In the shed stood two maidens of this kind. They had their place among shovels, hand-carts, wheelbarrows, and measuring tapes, and to all this company the news had come that the maidens were no longer to be called maidens, but hand-rammers, which word was the newest and the only correct designation among the pavers for the thing we all know from the old times by the name of the maiden. Now there are among us human creatures certain individuals who are known as emancipated women, as, for instance, principals of institution, dancers who stand professionally on one leg, milliners and sick nurses, and with this class of emancipated women the two maidens in the shed associated themselves. They were maidens among the paver folk, and determined not to give up this honorable appellation, and let themselves be miscalled rammers. Maiden is a human name, but hand-rammer is a thing, and we won't be called things. That's insulting us. My lover would be ready to give up his engagement, said the youngest, who was betrothed to a paver's hammer. And the hammer is the thing which drives great piles into the earth, like a machine, and therefore does on a large scale what 10 maidens effect in a similar way. He wants to marry me as a maiden, but whether he would have me were I a hand-rammer is a question, so I won't have my name changed. And I, said the elder one, would rather have both my arms broken off. But the wheelbarrow was of a different opinion, and the wheelbarrow was looked upon as of some consequence, for he considered himself a quarter of a coach, because he went about on one wheel. I must submit to your notice, he said, that the name maiden is common enough, and not nearly so refined as hand-rammer or stamper, which latter has also been proposed, and through which you would be introduced into the category of seals. And only think of the great stamp of state, which impresses the royal seal that gives effect to the laws. No, in your case, I would surrender my maiden name. No, certainly not, exclaimed the elder. I am too old for that.
I presume you have never heard of what is called European necessity,
observed the honest measuring tape.
One must be able to adapt oneself to time and circumstances, and if there is a law that the maiden is to be called hand-rammer, why, she must be called hand-rammer, and no pouting will avail, for everything has its measure.
No, if there must be a change, said the younger, I should prefer to be called Missy, for that reminds one a little of maidens. But I would rather be chopped to chips, said the elder. At last they all went to work. The maidens rode, that is, they were put in a wheelbarrow, and that was a distinction, but still they were called hand-rammers. May, they said as they were bumped upon the pavement, May! And they were very nearly pronouncing the whole word maiden, but they broke off short and swallowed the last syllable, for after mature deliberation they considered it beneath their dignity to protest. But they always called each other maiden, and praised the good old days, in which everything had been called by its right name, and those who were maidens were called maidens. And they remained as they were, for the hammer really broke off his engagement with the younger one, for nothing would suit him but he must have a maiden for his bride. End of Two Maidens by Hans Christian Andersen. Recording by Miriam Esther Goldman.
A Leaf from Heaven. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Bologna Times. A Leaf from Heaven, from Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. High up in the clear, pure air flew an angel, with a flower plucked from the garden of heaven. As he was kissing the flower, a very little leaf fell from it and sunk down into the soft earth in the middle of a wood. It immediately took root, sprouted, and sent out shoots among the other plants. "What a ridiculous little shoot!" said one. "No one will recognize it, not even the thistle, nor the stinging nettle." "It must be a kind of garden plant," said another, and so they sneered and despised the plant as a thing from a garden. "Where are you coming?" said the tall thistles, whose leaves were all armed with thorns. "It is stupid nonsense to allow yourself to shoot out in this way. We are not here to support you." Winter came, and the plant was covered with snow, but the snow glittered over it as if it had sunshine beneath as well as above. When spring came, the plant appeared in full bloom, a more beautiful object than any other plant in the forest. And now the professor of botany presented himself, one who could explain his knowledge in black and white. He examined and tested the plant, but it did not belong to his system of botany, nor could he possibly find out to what class it did belong. "It must be some degenerate species," said he. "I do not know it, and it is not mentioned in any system." "Not known in any system?" repeated the thistles and the nettles. The large trees which grew round it saw the plant and heard the remarks, but they said not a word, either good or bad, which is the wisest plan for those who are ignorant. There passed through the forest a poor innocent girl. Her heart was pure, and her understanding increased by her faith. Her chief inheritance had been an old Bible, which she read and valued. From its pages she heard the voice of God speaking to her, and telling her to remember what was said of Joseph's brethren when persons wished to injure her. They imagined evil in their hearts, but God turned it to good. If we suffer wrongfully, if we are misunderstood or despised, we must think of Him who was pure and holy, and who prayed for those who nailed Him to the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The girl stood still before the wonderful plant, for the green leaves exhaled a sweet and refreshing fragrance, and the flowers glittered and sparkled in the sunshine like colored flames, and the harmony of sweet sounds lingered round them, as if each concealed within itself a deep fount of melody, which thousands of years could not exhaust. With pious gratitude, the girl looked upon this glorious work of God, and bent down over one of the branches, that she might examine the flower and inhale the sweet perfume. Then a light broke in on her mind, and her heart expanded. Gladly would she have plucked a flower, but she could not overcome her reluctance to break one off. She knew it would so soon fade, so she took only a single green leaf, carried it home, and laid it in her Bible, where it remained ever green, fresh, and unfading. Between the pages of the Bible it still lay, when, a few weeks afterwards, that Bible was laid under the young girl's head in her coffin. A holy calm rested on her face, as if the earthly remains bore the impress of the truth that she now stood in the presence of God. In the forest the wonderful plant still continued to bloom, till it grew and became almost a tree, and all the birds of passage bowed themselves before it. "That plant is a foreigner, no doubt," said the thistles and the burdocks. "We can never conduct ourselves like that in this country." And the black forest snails actually spat at the flower. Then came the swineherd. He was collecting thistles and shrubs to burn them for the ashes. He pulled up the wonderful plant, roots and all, and placed it in his bundle. "This will be as useful as any," he said. So the plant was carried away. Not long after, the king of the country suffered from the deepest melancholy. He was diligent and industrious, but employment did him no good. They read deep and learned books to him, and then the lightest and most trifling that could be found, but all to no purpose. Then they applied for advice to one of the wise men of the world, and he sent them a message to say that there was one remedy which would relieve and cure him, and that it was a plant of heavenly origin which grew in the forest in the king's own dominions. The messenger described the flower so that its appearance could not be mistaken. Then said the swineherd, "I am afraid I carried this plant away from the forest in my bundle, and it has been burnt to ashes long ago, but I did not know any better." "You did not know any better? Ignorance upon ignorance, indeed!" The poor swineherd took these words to heart, for they were addressed to him. He knew not that there were others who were equally ignorant. Not even a leaf of the plant could be found. There was one, but it lay in the coffin of the dead. No one knew anything about it. Then the king, in his melancholy, wandered out to the spot in the wood. "Here is where the plant stood," he said. "It is a sacred place." Then he ordered that the place should be surrounded with a golden railing and a sentry stationed near it. The botanical professor wrote a long treatise about the heavenly plant, and for this he was loaded with gold, which improved the position of himself and his family. And this part is really the most pleasant part of the story, for the plant had disappeared, and the king remained as melancholy and sad as ever, but the sentry said he had always been so. End of A Leaf from Heaven by Hans Christian Andersen.
In the Uttermost Parts of the Sea by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Miriam Esther Goldman. In the Uttermost Parts of the Sea by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H. P. Paul. Some years ago, large ships were sent toward the North Pole, to explore the distant coasts, and to try how far men could penetrate into those unknown regions. For more than a year, one of these ships had been pushing its way northward amid snow and ice, and the sailors had endured many hardships, till at length winter set in, and the sun entirely disappeared. For many weeks there would be constant night. All around, as far as the eye could reach, nothing could be seen but fields of ice, in which the ship remained stuck fast. The snow lay piled up in great heaps, and of these the sailors made huts, in the form of beehives, some of them as large and spacious as one of the Huns' graves, and others only containing room enough to hold 3 or 4 men. It was not quite dark. The northern lights shot forth red and blue flames, like continuous fireworks, and the snow glittered and reflected back the light, so that the night here was one long twilight. When the moon was brightest, the natives came in crowds to see the sailors. They had a very singular appearance in their rough, hairy dresses of fur, and riding in sledges over the ice. They brought with them furs and skins in great abundance, so that the snow houses were soon provided with warm carpets, and the furs also served for the sailors to wrap themselves in when they slept under the roofs of snow, while outside it was freezing with a cold far more severe than in the winter with us. In our country it was still autumn, though late in the season, and they thought of that in their distant exile, and often pictured to themselves the yellow leaves on the trees at home. Their watches pointed to the hours of evening, and time to go to sleep, although in these regions it was now always night. In one of the huts 2 of the men laid themselves down to rest. The younger of these men had brought with him from home his dearest treasure, a Bible which his grandmother had given him on his departure. Every night the sacred volume rested under his head, and he had known from his childhood what was written in it. Every day he read in the book, and while stretched on his cold couch, the holy words he had learnt would come into his mind. If I take the wings of the morning, and fly to the uttermost parts of the sea, even there thou art with me, and thy right hand shall uphold me. And under the influence of that faith which these holy words inspired, sleep came upon him, and dreams which are the manifestation of God to the spirit. The soul lives and acts while the body is at rest. He felt this life in him, and it was as if he heard the sound of dear, well-known melodies, as if the breezes of summer floated around him, and over his couch shone a ray of brightness, as if it were shining through the covering of his snow-roof. He lifted his head, and saw that the bright gleaming was not the reflection of the glittering snow, but the dazzling brightness of the pinions of a mighty angel, into whose beaming face he was gazing. As from the cup of a lily, the angel rose from amidst the leaves of the Bible, and, stretching out his arm, the walls of the hut sunk down, as though they had been formed of a light, airy veil of mist, and the green hills and meadows of home, with its ruddy woods, lay spread around him in the quiet sunshine of a lovely autumn day. The nest of the stork was empty, but ripe fruit still hung on the wild apple tree, although the leaves had fallen. The red hips gleamed on the hedges, and the starling, which hung in the green cage outside the window of the peasant's hut, which was his home, whistled the tune which he had taught him. His grandmother hung green bird's food around the cage, as he, her grandson, had been accustomed to do. The daughter of the village blacksmith, who was young and fair, stood at the well drawing water. She nodded to the grandmother, and the old woman nodded to her, and pointed to a letter which had come from a long way off. That very morning the letter had arrived from the cold regions of the north, there where the absent one was sweetly sleeping under the protecting hand of God. They laughed and wept over the letter, and he, far away, amid ice and snow, under the shadow of the angel's wings, wept and smiled with them in spirit, for he saw and heard it all in his dream. From the letter they read aloud the words of Holy Writ. In the uttermost parts of the sea, thy right hand shall uphold me. And as the angel spread his wings like a veil over the sleeper, there was the sound of beautiful music and a hymn. Then the vision fled. It was dark again in the snow hut, but the Bible still rested beneath his head, and faith and hope dwelt in his heart. God was with him, and he carried home in his heart, even in the uttermost parts of the sea. End of In the Uttermost Parts of the Sea by Hans Christian Andersen. Recording by Miriam Esther Goldman. The Saucy Boy by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Miriam Esther Goldman. The Saucy Boy by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H.P. Paul. Once upon a time there was an old poet, one of those right good old poets. One evening, as he was sitting at home, there was a terrible storm going on outside. The rain was pouring down, but the old poet sat comfortably in his chimney corner, where the fire was burning and the apples were roasting. "There will be not a dry thread left on the poor people who are out in this weather," he said. "Oh, open the door! I am so cold and wet through!" called a little child outside. It was crying and knocking at the door, whilst the rain was pouring down and the wind was rattling all the windows. "Poor creature!" said the poet, and got up and opened the door. Before him stood a little boy. He was naked, and the water flowed from his long, fair locks. He was shivering with cold. If he had not been let in, he would certainly have perished in the storm.
"Poor little thing," said the poet, and took him by the hand. "Come to me, I will soon warm you. You shall have some wine and an apple, for you are such a pretty boy."
And he was, too. His eyes sparkled like two bright stars, and although the water flowed down from his fair locks, they still curled quite beautifully. He looked like a little angel, but was pale with cold and trembling all over. In his hand he held a splendid bow, but it had been entirely spoilt by the rain, and the colors of the pretty arrows had run into one another by getting wet. The old man sat down by the fire, and taking the little boy on his knee, wrung the water out of his locks, and warmed his hands in his own. He then made him some hot spiced wine, which quickly revived him, so that with reddening cheeks he sprang upon the floor and danced around the old man.
"You are a merry boy," said the latter. "What is your name?"
"My name is Cupid," he answered. "Don't you know me? There lies my bow. I shoot with that, you know. Look, the weather is getting fine again, the moon is shining."
"But your bow is spoilt," said the old poet.
"That would be unfortunate," said the little boy, taking it up and looking at it. "Oh, it's quite dry and isn't damaged at all. The string is quite tight. I'll try it." So, drawing it back, he took an arrow, aimed, and shot the good old poet right in the heart. "Do you see now that my bow is not spoiled?" he said, and, loudly laughing, ran away. What a naughty boy, to shoot the old poet like that, who had taken him into his warm room, had been so good to him, and had given him the nicest wine and the best apple! The good old man lay upon the floor crying. He was really shot in the heart.
"Oh," he cried, "what a naughty boy this Cupid is! I shall tell all the good children about this, so that they take care never to play with him, lest he hurt them."
And all good children, both girls and boys whom he told about this, were on their guard against wicked Cupid, but he deceives them all the same, for he is very deep. When the students come out of class, he walks beside them with a book under his arm, and wearing a black coat. They cannot recognize him. And then, if they take him by the arm, believing him to be a student too, he sticks an arrow into their chest. And when the girls go to church to be confirmed, he is amongst them too. In fact, he is always after people. He sits in the large chandelier in the theatre and blazes away, so that people think it is a lamp, but they soon find out their mistake. He walks about in the castle garden and on the promenades. Yes, once he shot your father and your mother in the heart too. Just ask them, and you will hear what they say. Oh, he is a bad boy, this Cupid, and you must never have anything to do with him, for he is after everyone. Just think, he even shot an arrow at old grandmother, but that was a long time ago. The wound has long been healed, but such things are never forgotten. Now you know what a bad boy this wicked Cupid is. End of The Saucy Boy by Hans Christian Andersen. Recording by Miriam Esther Goldman.
Great Klaus and Little Klaus by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Margaret Espaillat. Great Klaus and Little Klaus by Hans Christian Andersen. Translated by H. W. Dulkin, Ph.D. There lived two men in one village, and they had the same name. Each was called Klaus, but one had 4 horses, and the other only a single horse. To distinguish them from each other, folks called him who had 4 horses Great Klaus, and the one who had only a single horse Little Klaus. Now we shall hear what happened to each of them, for this is a true story. The whole week through Little Klaus was obliged to plow for Great Klaus, and to lend him his 1 horse. Then Great Klaus helped him out with all his 4, but only once a week, and that on a holiday. Hurrah! How Little Claus smacked his whip over all 5 horses, for they were as good as his own on that one day. The sun shone gaily, and all the bells in the steeples were ringing. The people were all dressed in their best, and were going to church, with their hymn books under their arms, to hear the clergyman preach. And they saw Little Claus plowing with 5 horses, but he was so merry that he smacked his whip again, and cried, "Gee up, all my 5!" "You must not talk so," said Great Claus, "for only 1 horse is yours." But when no one was passing, Little Claus forgot that he was not to say this, and he cried, "Gee up, all my horses!" "Now I must beg of you to let that alone," cried Great Claus, "for if you say it again, I shall hit your horse on the head so that it will fall down dead, and then it will be all over with him." "I will certainly not say it any more," said Little Claus. But when people came by soon afterwards and nodded good day to him, he became very glad and thought it looked very well, after all, that he had 5 horses to plow his field, and so he smacked his whip again and cried, "Gee up, all my horses!" "I'll gee up your horses," said Great Claus, and he took the hatchet and hit the only horse of Little Claus on the head, so that it fell down and was dead immediately. "Oh, now I haven't any horse at all," said Little Claus, and began to cry. Then he flayed the horse and let the hide dry in the wind, and put it in a sack and hung it over his shoulder, and went to the town to sell his horse's skin. He had a very long way to go, and was obliged to pass through a great dark wood, and the weather became dreadfully bad. He went quite astray, and before he got into the right way again it was evening, and it was too far to get home again or even to the town before nightfall. Close by the road stood a large farmhouse. The shutters were closed outside the windows, but the light could still be seen shining out over them. "I may be able to get leave to stop here through the night," thought Little Claus, and he went and knocked. The farmer's wife opened the door, but when she heard what he wanted, she told him to go away, declaring that her husband was not at home and she would not receive strangers. "Then I shall have to lie outside," said Little Claus, and the farmer's wife shut the door in his face. Close by stood a great haystack, and between this and the farmhouse was a little outhouse thatched with straw. "Up there I can lie," said Little Claus, when he looked up at the roof. "That is a capital bed. I suppose the stork won't fly down and bite me in the legs," for a living stork was standing on the roof where he had his nest. Now Little Claus climbed up to the roof of the shed where he lay, and turned round to settle himself comfortably. The wooden shutters did not cover the windows at the top, and he could look straight into the room. There was a great table with a cloth laid, and wine, and roast meat, and a glorious fish upon it. The farmer's wife and the clerk were seated at the table, and nobody besides. She was filling his glass, and he was digging his fork into the fish, for that was his favorite dish. "If one could only get some too," thought Little Claus, as he stretched out his head towards the window. Heavens, what a glorious cake he saw standing there! Yes, certainly that was a feast. Now he heard someone riding along the high road. It was the woman's husband, who was coming home. He was a good man enough, but he had the strange peculiarity that he could never bear to see a clerk. If a clerk appeared before his eyes, he became quite wild. And that was the reason why the clerk had gone to the wife to wish her good day, because he knew that her husband was not at home, and the good woman therefore put the best fare she had before him. But when they heard the man coming, they were frightened, and the woman begged the clerk to creep into a great empty chest which stood there, and he did so, for he knew the husband could not bear the sight of a clerk. The woman quickly hid all the excellent meat and wine in her baking oven, for if the man had seen that, he would have been certain to ask what it meant. "Ah, yes," sighed Little Claus, up in his shed when he saw all the good fare put away. "Is there anyone up there?" asked the farmer, and he looked up at Little Claus. "Who are you lying there? Better come with me into the room." And Little Claus told him how he had lost his way and asked leave to stay there for the night. "Yes, certainly," said the peasant, "but first we must have something to live on." The woman received them both in a very friendly way, spread the cloth on the long table, and gave them a great dish of porridge. The farmer was hungry and ate with a good appetite, but Little Claus could not help thinking of the capital roast meat, fish, and cake which he knew were in the oven. Under the table at his feet he had laid the sack with the horse's hide in it, for we know that he had come out to sell it in the town. He could not relish the porridge, so he trod upon the sack, and the dry skin inside crackled quite loudly. "Why, what have you in your sack?" asked the farmer. "Oh, that's a magician," answered Little Claus. "He says we are not to eat porridge, for he has conjured the oven full of roast meat, fish, and cake." "Wonderful!" cried the farmer, and he opened the oven in a hurry and found all the dainty provisions which his wife had hidden there, but which, as he thought, the wizard had conjured forth. The woman dared not say anything, but put the things at once on the table, and so they both ate of the meat, the fish, and the cake. Now Little Claus again trod on his sack and made the hide creak. "What does he say now?" said the farmer. "He says," replied Claus, "that he has conjured 3 bottles of wine for us too, and that they are standing there in the corner behind the oven." Now the woman was obliged to bring out the wine which she had hidden, and the farmer drank it and became very merry. He would have been very glad to see such a conjurer as Little Claus had there in the sack. "Can he conjure the demon forth?" asked the farmer. "I should like to see him, for now I am merry." "Oh, yes," said Little Claus. "My conjurer can do anything that I ask of him. Can you not?" he added, and trod on the hide so that it crackled. "He says yes, but the demon is very ugly to look at. We had better not see him." "Oh, I'm not at all afraid. Pray, what will he look like?" "Why, he'll look the very image of a clerk." "Ah," said the farmer, "that is ugly. You must know I can't bear the sight of a clerk. But it doesn't matter now, for I know that he's a demon, so I shall easily stand it. Now I have courage, but he must not come too near me." "Now I will ask my conjurer," said Little Claus, and he trod on the sack and held his ear down. "What does he say?" "He says you may go and open the chest that stands in the corner, and you will see the demon crouching in it, but you must hold the lid so that he doesn't slip out." "Will you help me to hold him?" asked the farmer, and he went to the chest where the wife had hidden the real clerk, who sat in there and was very much afraid. The farmer opened the lid a little way and peeped in underneath. "Huh!" he cried, and sprang backward. "Yes, now I've seen him, and he looked exactly like our clerk. Oh, that was dreadful." Upon this they must drink, so they sat and drank until late into the night. "You must sell me that conjurer," said the farmer. "Ask as much as you like for him. I'll give you a whole bushel of money directly." "No, that I can't do," said Little Claus. "Only think how much use I can make of this conjurer." "Oh, I should so much like to have him," cried the farmer, and he went on begging. "Well," said Little Claus at last, "as you have been so kind as to give me shelter for the night, I will let it be so. You shall have the conjurer for a bushel of money, but I must have the bushel heaped up." "That you shall have," replied the farmer. "But you must take the chest yonder away with you. I will not keep it in my house an hour. One cannot know. Perhaps he may be there still." Little Claus gave the farmer his sack with the dry hide in it, and got in exchange a whole bushel of money, and that heaped up. The farmer also gave him a big truck on which to carry off his money and chest. "Farewell," said Little Claus, and he went off with his money and the big chest in which the clerk was still sitting. On the other side of the wood was a great deep river. The water rushed along so rapidly that one could scarcely swim against the stream. A fine new bridge had been built over it. Little Klaus stopped on the center of the bridge and said quite loud so that the clerk could hear it, "What shall I do with this stupid chest? It's as heavy as if stones were in it. I shall only get tired if I drag it any further, so I'll throw it into the river. If it swims home to me, well and good, and if it does not, it will be no great matter." And he took the chest with one hand and lifted it up a little as if he intended to throw it into the river. "No, let be!" cried the clerk from within the chest. "Let me out first." "Whew!" exclaimed Little Klaus, pretending to be frightened. "He's in there still! I must make haste and throw him into the river, that he may be drowned." "Oh, no, no!" screamed the clerk. "I'll give you a whole bushelful of money if you'll let me go." "Why, that's another thing," said Little Klaus, and he opened the chest. The clerk crept quickly out, pushed the empty chest into the water, and went to his house, where Little Klaus received a whole bushelful of money. He had already received one from the farmer, and so now he had his truck loaded with money. "See, I've been well paid for the horse," he said to himself when he had got home to his own room, and was emptying all the money into a heap in the middle of the floor. "That will vex Great Klaus when he hears how rich I have grown through my one horse, but I won't tell him about it outright." So he sent a boy to Great Klaus to ask for a bushel measure. "What can he want with it?" thought Great Klaus, and he smeared some tar underneath the measure, so that some part of whatever was measured should stick to it. And thus it happened, for when he received the measure back, there were 3 new 8-shilling pieces adhering thereto. "What's this?" cried Great Klaus, and he ran off at once to Little Klaus. "Where did you get all that money from?" "Oh, that's from my horse's skin. I sold it yesterday evening." "That's really being well paid," said Great Klaus, and he ran home in a hurry, took an axe, and killed all his 4 horses. Then he flayed them and carried off their skins to the town. "Hides! Hides! Who'll buy any hides?" he cried through the streets. All the shoemakers and tanners came running and asked how much he wanted for them. "A bushel of money for each," said Great Klaus. "Are you mad?" said they. "Do you think we have money by the bushel?" "Hides! Hides!" he cried again, and to all who asked him what the hides would cost, he replied, "A bushel of money." "He wants to make fools of us," they all exclaimed, and the shoemakers took their straps, and the tanners their aprons, and they began to beat Great Klaus. "Hides! Hides!" they called after him jeeringly. "Yes, we'll tan your hide for you till the red broth runs down. Out of the town with him!" And Great Klaus made the best haste he could, for he had never yet been thrashed as he was thrashed now. "Well," said he when he got home, "Little Klaus shall pay for this. I'll kill him for it." Now, at Little Klaus's the old grandmother had died. She had been very harsh and unkind to him, but yet he was very sorry, and took the dead woman and laid her in his warm bed, to see if she would not come to life again. There he intended she should remain all through the night, and he himself would sit in the corner and sleep on a chair, as he had often done before. As he sat there in the night, the door opened, and Great Klaus came in with his axe. He knew where Little Klaus's bed stood, and going straight up to it, he hit the old grandmother on the head, thinking she was Little Klaus. "Do you see?" said he. "You shall not make a fool of me again." And then he went home. "That's a bad fellow, that man," said Little Klaus. "He wanted to kill me. It was a good thing for my old grandmother that she was dead already. He would have taken her life." And he dressed his grandmother in her Sunday clothes, borrowed a horse of his neighbor, harnessed it to a car, and put the old lady on the back seat so that she could not fall out when he drove. and so they trundled through the wood. When the sun rose, they were in front of an inn. There Little Claus pulled up and went in to have some refreshment. The host had very, very much money. He was also a very good man, but exceedingly hot, as if he had pepper and tobacco in him.
"Good morning," said he to Little Claus. "You've put on your Sunday clothes early today."
"Yes," answered Little Claus. "I'm going to town with my old grandmother. She's sitting there on the car without. I can't bring her into the room. Will you give her a glass of mead? But you must speak very loud, for she can't hear very well."
"Yes, that I'll do,"
said the host, and he poured out a great glass of mead and went out with it to the dead grandmother, who had been placed upright in the carriage.
"Here's a glass of mead from your son,"
quoth mine host. But the dead woman replied not a word, but sat quite still.
"Don't you hear?" cried the host as loud as he could. "Here is a glass of mead from your son."
Once more he called out the same thing, but as she persisted in not hearing him, he became angry at last and threw the glass in her face, so that the mead ran down over her nose and she tumbled backward into the car, for she had only been put upright and not bound fast. "Hallo!" cried Little Claus, running out at the door and seizing the host by the breast. "You've killed my grandmother now. See, there's a big hole in her forehead."
"Oh, here's a misfortune," cried the host, wringing his hand. "That all comes of my hot temper. Dear Little Claus, I'll give you a bushel of money and have your grandmother buried as if she were my own. Only keep quiet, or I shall have my head cut off, and that would be so very disagreeable."
So Little Claus again received a whole bushel of money, and the host buried the old grandmother as if she had been his own. And when Little Claus came home with all his money, he at once sent his boy to Great Claus to ask to borrow a bushel measure.
"What's that?" said Great Claus. "Have I not killed him? I must go myself and see to this."
And so he went over himself with the bushel to Little Claus.
"Now, where did you get all that money from?"
he asked, and he opened his eyes wide when he saw all that had been brought together. "You killed my grandmother and not me," replied Little Claus, "and I've been and sold her and got a whole bushel of money for her."
"That's really being well paid,"
said Great Claus, and he hastened home, took an axe, and killed his own grandmother directly. Then he put her on a carriage and drove off to the town with her to where the apothecary lived, and asked him if he would buy a dead person.
"Who is it, and where did you get him from?" asked the apothecary.
"It's my grandmother," answered Great Claus. "I've killed her to get a bushel of money for her."
"Heaven save us!" cried the apothecary. "You're raving! Don't say such things, or you may lose your head." And he told him earnestly what a bad deed this was that he had done, and what a bad man he was, and that he must be punished. And Great Claus was so frightened that he jumped out of the surgery straight into his carriage, and whipped the horses and drove home. But the apothecary and all the people thought him mad, and so they let him drive whither he would.
"You shall pay for this," said Great Claus when he was out upon the high road. "Yes, you shall pay me for this, Little Claus."
And directly he got home, he took the biggest sack he could find, and went over to Little Claus and said,
"Now you've tricked me again. First I killed my horses and then my old grandmother. That's all your fault, but you shall never trick me any more."
And he seized Little Claus round the body, and thrust him into the sack, and took him upon his back, and called out to him,
"Now I shall go off with you and drown you."
It was a long way that he had to travel before he came to the river, and Little Claus was not too light to carry. The road led him close to a church, the organ was playing, and the people were singing so beautifully. Then Great Claus put down his sack with Little Claus in it close to the church door, and thought it would be a very good thing to go in and hear a psalm before he went further, for Little Klaus could not get out, and all the people were in church, and so he went in. Ah, yes, yes, sighed Little Klaus in the sack, and he turned and twisted, but he found it impossible to loosen the cord. Then there came by an old drover with snow-white hair and a great staff in his hand. He was driving a whole herd of cows and oxen before him, and they stumbled against the sack in which Little Klaus was confined, so that it was overthrown. "Oh dear," sighed Little Klaus, "I'm so young yet, and I'm to go to heaven directly." "And I, poor fellow," said the drover, "I am so old already, and I can't get there yet." "Open the sack," cried Little Klaus. "Creep into it instead of me, and you will get to heaven directly." "With all my heart," replied the drover, and he untied the sack, out of which Little Klaus crept forth immediately. "But will you look after the cattle?" said the old man, and he crept into the sack at once, whereupon Little Klaus tied it up and went his way with all the cows and oxen. Soon afterwards Great Klaus came out of the church. He took the sack on his shoulders again, although it seemed to him as if the sack had become lighter, for the old drover was only half as heavy as Little Klaus. "How light he is to carry now! Yes, that is because I've heard a psalm." So he went to the river, which was deep and broad, threw the sack with the old drover in it into the water, and called after him, thinking that it was Little Klaus, "You lie there. Now you shan't trick me any more." Then he went home, but when he came to a place where there was a crossroad, he met Little Klaus driving all his beasts. "What's this?" cried Great Klaus. "Have I not drowned you?" "Yes," replied Little Klaus. "You threw me into the river less than half an hour ago." "But wherever did you get all those fine beasts from?" asked Great Klaus. "These beasts are sea cattle," replied Little Klaus. "I'll tell you the whole story, and thank you for drowning me, for now I'm at the top of the tree. I am really rich. How frightened I was when I lay huddled in the sack, and the wind whistled about my ears when you threw me down from the bridge into the cold water. I sank to the bottom immediately, but I did not knock myself, for the most splendid soft grass grows down there. Upon that I fell, and immediately the sack was opened, and the loveliest maiden, with snow-white garments and a green wreath upon her wet hair, took me by the hand and said, 'Are you come, Little Klaus? Here you have some cattle to begin with. A mile farther along the road there is a whole herd more which I will give to you.' And now I saw that the river formed a great highway for the people of the sea. Down in its bed they walked and drove directly from the sea and straight into the land to where the river ends. Then it was so beautifully full of flowers and of the freshest grass. The fishes which swam in the water shot past my ears just as hear the birds in the air. What pretty people there were there, and what fine cattle pasturing on mounds and in ditches." "But why did you come up again to us directly?" asked Great Klaus. "I should not have done that if it is so beautiful down there." "Why," replied Little Klaus, "in that I just acted with good policy. You heard me tell you that the sea maiden said, 'A mile farther along the road,' and by the road she meant the river, for she can't go anywhere else. 'There's a whole herd of cattle for you.' But I know what bends the stream makes, sometimes this way, sometimes that. There's a long way to go round. No, the thing can be managed in a shorter way by coming here to the land, and driving across the fields towards the river again. In this manner I save myself almost half a mile, and get all the quicker to my sea cattle." "Oh, you are a fortunate man," said Great Klaus. "Do you think I should get some sea cattle too if I went down to the bottom of the river?" "Yes, I think so," replied Little Klaus. "But I cannot carry you in the sack as far as the river. You are too heavy for me." But if you will go there and creep into the sack yourself, I will throw you in with a great deal of pleasure."
"Thanks," said Great Claus, "but if I don't get any sea cattle when I am down there, I shall beat you, you may be sure."
"Oh, no, don't be so fierce." And so they went together to the river. When the beasts which were thirsty saw the stream, they ran as fast as they could to get at the water. "See how they hurry," cried Little Claus. "They are longing to get back to the bottom."
"Yes, but help me first," said Great Claus, "or else you shall be beaten."
And so he crept into the great sack, which had been laid across the back of one of the oxen.
"Put a stone in it, for I'm afraid I shan't sink else," said Great Claus.
"That can be done," replied Little Claus, and he put a big stone into the sack, tied the rope tightly, and pushed against it. Plump! There lay Great Claus in the river, and sank at once to the bottom. "I'm afraid he won't find the cattle," said Little Claus, and then he drove homeward with what he had. End of Great Claus and Little Claus by Hans Christian Andersen.